Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and here we are for another episode of History and Truth. Today, we are back at the bridge on the River Kwai at the River Kwai View Hotel in Kanchanaburi. Today, we are doing part 2 of the detailed description of the Burma Campaign. Today, we'll talk about 1944. Here's the Burma Campaign of 1944. In this picture is a C-47 transport, and this aircraft is dropping supplies by parachute to Allied troops in action against Japanese forces, a common event during the fighting in Burma and India during 1944. The fighting in the Burma Campaign in 1944 was among the most severe in the Southeast Asian theater of World War II. It took place along the borders between Burma and India, and Burma and China, and involved the British Commonwealth, Chinese, and United States forces against the forces of Imperial Japan and the Indian National Army. British Commonwealth land forces were drawn primarily from the United Kingdom, British India, and Africa. The Allies had overcome the logistic and organizational difficulties which had crippled their earlier efforts, and they were preparing to invade Japanese-occupied Burma at several widely separated points. The Japanese forestalled them by launching their own offensive into India, and this offensive became larger in scope than originally intended. By the end of the year, the Allies had achieved significant territorial gains only in one sector, the extreme northeast of Burma. But the Japanese attack on India had been defeated with very heavy casualties. This handicapped the Japanese attempts to defend Burma against renewed Allied offensives in the following year. Rival plans. The Allied plans. After the Japanese invasion of Burma in early 1942, the Allies had launched tentative counterattacks in late 1942 and early 1943, despite lack of preparation and resources. This resulted in an Allied defeat in the coastal Arakan province of Burma, here, and a questionable success in the first Shinjit long-range raid into Burma, codenamed Operation Longcloth. In August 1943, the Allies created Southeast Asia Command, SEAC, a new combined command responsible for the Southeast Asian theater. Its commander-in-chief was Admiral Louis Mountbatten. This brought a new sense of purpose in November, when SEAC took over responsibility for Burma, the newly formed British 14th Army was ready to take the offensive. The substantial improvement in the effectiveness of the troops which 14th Army inherited has been credited to its commander, Lieutenant General William Slim. He enforced the use of anti-malarial drugs as part of an emphasis on individual health, and he established realistic jungle warfare training. He also rebuilt the Army's self-respect by winning easy, small-scale victories and developed local military infrastructure. Slim's efforts were aided by improvements to the Allied lines of communication. By October 1944, capacity on the Northeast Indian railways had been raised from 600 tons a day at the start of the war to 4,400 tons a day. The Allied Eastern Air Command, which consisted mainly of Royal Air Force squadrons, but also several units of the Indian Air Force and bomber and transport units of the United States Army Air Forces, the USAAF, had gained air superiority, and this allowed the Allies to employ new tactics, relying upon air support and aerial resupply of troops. SEAC had to accommodate several rival plans. First one is Admiral Mountbatten, as a naval officer who had previously served as commander of Combined Operations HQ, favored amphibious landings. The first of these was to be on the Andaman Islands, Operation Buccaneer. But the landing craft assigned to the operation were recalled to Europe in preparation for the Normandy landings. The previous year, a British attack into the Burmese coastal province of Arakan had been heavily defeated. Having been reorganized, 15th Corps had taken over this part of the front and was preparing to renew the offensive with the aim of capturing Akyab Island, again here, important for its port and airfield. A limited amphibious move, Operation Pigstick, in support of this attack had to be abandoned for lack of the necessary landing craft and other shipping. The American aim in the China-Burma-India theater was to maintain military aid and supplies to the Republic of China under Chiang Kai-shek, with its wartime capital in Chongqing, just over the border. They had established an air supply route known as the Hump over the Himalayas to Kunming in the Chinese province of Yunnan. Some Chinese forces which had retreated into India in early 1942 had been re-equipped and retrained by an American military mission under Lieutenant General Joseph Stilwell, who was also Chief of Staff to Chiang Kai-shek and Deputy Commander of SEAC. Stillwell proposed to construct a new road, the Lido Road, to link India and China by land, in here. Although British leaders were skeptical about the value of this road and the effort devoted to it. By the start of 1944, the new road had reached the far side of the Patkai Mountains, and Stilwell was preparing to advance on Kamang and Myitkyina in northern Burma. Chiang Kai-shek had agreed to mount an offensive across the Salween River into eastern Burma from Yunnan. When the Andaman Island landings were cancelled, he claimed this was a breach of faith and cancelled the Yunnan offensive, although he later reinstated it. The next point was that after a long-distance raid, Operation Longcloth, in 1943 by a long-range penetration force known as the Chindits, British Major General Ord Wingate had gained approval for the force and its scope of operations to be greatly expanded. This was opposed by Slim and others who felt that this was too great a drain on manpower and resources. But under political pressure from Winston Churchill, Wingate's plans went ahead. The Chindits designated Indian 3rd Infantry Division for cover purposes were to assist Stilwell by disrupting the Japanese lines of supply to the northern front. Wingate had originally planned that an airborne brigade would capture a Japanese-held airfield at Indao, which would then be garrisoned by a line infantry division. As a base for airfield for their further Chindit raids. This second part of the plan for Wingate's Special Force, which would have imposed heavy demands on the available transport aircraft and also required troops already allocated to other operations, was later dropped. After protracted staff discussions within India and between the Allied staffs and commanders in London, Washington, and Chongqing, the Allied plans for 1944 were reduced to the offensive by Stilwell's Chinese troops from Ledo, the Chindit operation in support of Stilwell, the renewed overland attack in Arakan, and a rather ill-defined offensive across the Chindwin River from Imphal in support of the other operations. Japanese plans. About the same time that SEAC was established, the Japanese had created a new headquarters, Burma Area Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Masakazu Kawabe. Its subordinate formations were the Japanese 15th Army in the north and east of Burma, and the Japanese 28th Army in the south and west. By chance or design, the new commander of 15th Army, Lieutenant General Renya Mutaguchi, had played a major part in many recent Japanese triumphs. He had, for example, been the officer immediately concerned in the Marco Polo Bridge incident in 1937. So he's the one that started World War II in China, which started hostilities between Japan and China, and stated his belief that it was his destiny to win the war for Japan. He was keen to mount an offensive against India. Burma Area Army originally quashed this idea, but Mutaguchi's persistent advocacy won over officers at Southern Expeditionary Army Group at Singapore, the HQ of all Japanese forces in Southern Asia. Finally, Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo approved Mutaguchi's plan. Officers who opposed Mutaguchi's plans were transferred or sidelined. Neither Kawabe nor Field Marshal Hisaichi Terauchi, the Commander-in-Chief of Southern Expeditionary Army Group, were given any opportunity to veto Mutaguchi's plan or to control the operation once it had started. The Japanese were influenced to an unknown degree by Subhas Chandra Bose, commander of the Indian National Army. This was composed largely of Indian soldiers who had been captured in Malaya or Singapore, and some Tamil laborers living in Malaya. At Bose's instigation, a substantial contingent of the INA joined in the Chalo Delhi, the March on Delhi. Both Bose and Mutaguchi emphasized the advantages which would be gained by a successful attack into India. With misgivings on the part of several of Mutaguchi's superiors and subordinates, Operation Yugo was launched. Northern Front. Stilwell's forces, the Northern Combat Area Command, initially consisted of 2 American-equipped Chinese divisions, with a Chinese-manned M3 Light Tank Battalion and an American Long-Range Penetration Brigade, known after its commander as Merrill's Marauders. 3 Chinese divisions were later flown from Yunnan to Ledo to reinforce Stilwell. This is a map of Stilwell's operations in North Burma. Oh, yeah. As you see, Stilwell is moving here through the jungle against these Japanese positions and making quite a lot of progress. In October 1943, the Chinese 38th Division, led by Sun Li-jen, began to advance from Ledo towards Shinbuiyang, here, while American engineers and Indian laborers extended the Ledo Road behind them. The Japanese 18th Division advanced to the Chinwin to stop them, but found itself outmatched. Whenever the Chinese 22nd and 38th Divisions ran into Japanese strongpoints, the Marauders were used to outflank Japanese positions by going through the jungle, a technique which had served the Japanese so well earlier in the war, before the Allies had learnt the arts of jungle warfare, and was now being used against them. At Walao Bum, for example, if the Chinese 38th Division had been a little swifter and linked up with the Marauders, it could have encircled the Japanese 18th Division. As you see, they came around, but they still escaped. If they had been a little bit faster, they could have got the entire division. Not only were the Japanese driven back, but the Allies were able to use the trace of the track the Japanese had constructed to supply the 18th Division to speed their construction of the Lado Road. So the Lado Road became an improvement of the Japanese road. The Second Chindit Expedition. In Operation Thursday, the Chindits were to support Stilwell's advance by interdicting Japanese supply lines in the region of Indao. On 5th February 1944, Brigadier Bernard Ferguson's 16th Brigade set out from Lado on foot. They crossed exceptionally difficult terrain which the Japanese had not guarded and penetrated the Japanese rear areas. In early March, 3 other brigades were flown into landing zones behind the Japanese lines by the USAAF 1st Air Commando Group, from where they established strongholds on most of the Japanese road and rail links to their northern front. Over the next 2.5 months, the Chindits were involved in many very heavy battles with the Japanese. Brigadier Michael Calvert's 77th Brigade successfully defended one of the landing zones, codenamed Broadway, and established a road and railway block at Maulu, north of Indao. This position, codenamed the White City, was successfully held for several weeks. Not all communications to the Japanese northern front were blocked, as only a single Chindit battalion operated against the road from Bamo to Mitkina, beyond the range of effective Allied air support. They're here now. On 24th March, Ferguson's brigade attempted to capture the airfield at Indao, but was repulsed, after which the exhausted brigade was withdrawn to India. On the same day, Wingate, the commander of the Chindits, was killed in an air crash. His replacement was Brigadier Joe Lentaigne, formerly the commander of the 111th Brigade, one of the Chindit formations. On 17th May, overall control of the Chindits was transferred from Slim's 14th Army to Stilwell's NCAC. The Chindits evacuated Broadway and the White City and moved from the Japanese rear areas to new bases closer to Stilwell's front. They were given additional tasks for which they were not equipped. At the same time, the Japanese replaced the scratch Take force, which had been trying to defend the rear areas, with the newly formed headquarters of the Japanese 33rd Army, and deployed the 53rd Division against the Chindits. The 111th Brigade, commanded by John Masters, tried to establish another road and rail block, codenamed Blackpool, near Hopin, but were forced to retreat on 25th May after 17 days of battle. The monsoon had broken, making movement difficult and preventing the other Chindit formations reinforcing Masters' brigade. The Yunnan Front. The Chinese forces on the Yunnan Front mounted an attack starting in the second with nearly 40,000 troops crossing the Salween River on a 200-mile, 320-kilometer front. Here, they're crossing the Salween River. Within a few days, some 12 Chinese divisions, totaling 72,000 men, under the command of General Wei Li Huang, were attacking the Japanese 56th Division. The Japanese forces in the north were now fighting on two fronts, against the Allies from the northwest and the Nationalist Chinese from the northeast. They're fighting in two places. The Chinese Yunnan offensive was hampered by the monsoon rains and lack of air support. American observers with the Chinese armies also criticized the Chinese leadership. The Chinese nevertheless succeeded in surrounding the garrison at Tengchung at the end of May. The defenders held out before being annihilated in late September. Further south, the Chinese captured Longling at the end of August after overcoming determined Japanese resistance, at which the Japanese were helped when Chinese plans and codes fell into their hands by chance. At this point, the Japanese moved reinforcements amounting to a further division in strength to Yunnan and counterattacked, temporarily halting the Chinese advance. Myitkyina and Moguang. While the Japanese offensive on the Central Front was being waged, Stilwell's forces continued to make gains. On 19th May, the Chinese 22nd and 38th Divisions encircled Kamai. 2 days before, on 17th May, Merrill's forces captured the airfield at Myitkyina after a march across the Kumon Bum Mountains, which nearly crippled the already weary marauders. If Chinese troops from Ledo had been flown in that afternoon to attack the town immediately, they could have overwhelmed the small garrison. But support and logistic units were flown in first, and the opportunity to capture the town easily was lost as Japanese reinforcements arrived in the town. The resulting prolonged siege was not very well directed and cost the Allies many men, particularly amongst the marauders, who were kept in the line for reasons of American prestige, and among the Chindits, who were forced to remain in the field to disrupt Japanese relief attempts far longer than had been planned. However, because of the deteriorating situation on the other fronts, the Japanese never regained the initiative on the northern front. Here is an American M1A1 75mm pack howitzer supporting Galahad's operations at Myitkyina. In late May, Stilwell ordered the Chindits to capture Moguang to cut the Japanese line of communications to Myitkyina. Calvert's 77th Brigade began the attack, anticipating that the town would be captured by 5th June. The Japanese garrison actually outnumbered the attackers. The 77th Brigade eventually captured Moguang after a siege which ended on 27th June at the cost of 50% casualties. By July, it had become clear that all the Chindits were exhausted by continuous marching and fighting under heavy monsoon rains, and they were withdrawn. By the end of the campaign, the Chindits had lost 1,396 killed and 2,434 wounded. Over half the remainder had to be hospitalized with a special diet afterwards. The British 36th Division was transferred from the Arakan to Stilwell's command to replace the Chindits. Here is Brigadier Mike Calvert on the left, who's giving orders to Lieutenant Colonel Shaw, with the on the right, Major James Lumley, after the capture of Moguang. The still continuing siege of Myitkyina resulted in heavy Japanese losses. When the airfield was captured, the Japanese in the town at first intended to fight a delaying action only, aided by the monsoon rains. On 10th July, Major General Genzo Mizukami, who had been sent with reinforcements and placed in charge of the garrison, was ordered personally to defend Myitkyina to the death. The Japanese dug in and repelled several Chinese attacks. Further resistance appeared hopeless by the end of July. Mizukami evacuated the survivors of the garrison before fulfilling the letter of his orders by taking his own life inside the defended perimeter. Myitkyina was finally captured on 3rd August. The capture of Mogwang and Myitkyina marked the end of the initial phase of Stilwell's campaign. It was the largest seizure of Japanese-held territory to date in the Burma Campaign. The airfield at Myitkyina became a vital link in the air route over the hump. The Southern Front, 1943 to 1944. In Arakan, 15th Corps, commanded by Lieutenant General Philip Christensen, renewed the advance on the Mayu Peninsula. Ranges of steep hills channeled the advance into 3 attacks by 5th Indian Division along the coast, 7th Indian Division along the Kalapansin River, and 81st West Africa Division along the Caledon River. The 5th Indian Division captured the small port of Mongdao on 9th January 1944. The Corps then prepared to capture 2 disused railway tunnels which linked Mongdao with the Kalapansin Valley. However, the Japanese struck first. A strong force from the Japanese 55th Division infiltrated Allies' lines to attack the 7th Indian Division from the rear, overrunning the divisional HQ. Here is an image of after the headquarters of the 7th Indian Division is surrounded by the Japanese. Allied tanks and infantry fight to break the encirclement, and a number of prisoners are taken. Unlike the previous occasions on which this had happened, the Allied forces stood firm against the attack, and supplies were dropped to them by parachute. In the Battle of the Admin Box from 5th to 23rd February, the Japanese concentrated on 15th Corps' administrative area, defended mainly by service troops, but they were unable to deal with tanks supporting the defenders. Troops from the 5th Indian Division broke through the Ngakye-Dok Pass to relieve the defenders of the box. Although battle casualties were approximately equal, the overall result was a heavy Japanese defeat. Their infiltration and encirclement tactics had failed to panic Allied troops, and as the Japanese were unable to capture enemy supplies, they themselves starved. Here is a view behind a Dakota aircraft after dropping supplies for the 7th Indian Division into a dry riverbed near Sinzueya. Two fresh Allied divisions, the 26th Indian Division and the British 36th Division, took over the front in the Mayu Peninsula and resumed the offensive. However, 15th Corps' offensive wound down over the next few weeks as the Allies concentrated their resources, particularly transport aircraft, on the Central Front. After capturing the railway tunnels and some hills which dominated the Mongdao-Buthidraw Road, 15th Corps halted during the monsoon. Some ground in the malarial Kalapansin Valley was given up to reduce losses to disease, and Japanese counterattacks forced the isolated 81st West Africa Division to retreat up the Caledon Valley. Central Front. This is the Imphal and Kohima campaign. Here is the attack towards Imphal and Kohima. Here is where the Chindits were, main operation. Here are the main Chinese attacks. And by the end of the stage, the Japanese will lose this entire section here. At Imphal, 4th Corps under Lieutenant General Jeffrey Scoons had pushed forward 2 divisions to the Chinwin River. 1 division was in reserve at Imphal. There were indications that a major Japanese offensive was building, and Slim and Scoons planned to withdraw and force the Japanese to fight at the end of impossibly long and difficult supply lines. However, they misjudged the date on which the Japanese were to attack and the strength they would use against some objectives. The main body of the Japanese 15th Army, consisting of the 33rd Division, 15th Division, and the brigade-sized Yamamoto Force, planned to cut off and destroy the forward divisions of 4th Corps before capturing Imphal. The 31st Division would meanwhile isolate Imphal by capturing Kohima. Mutaguchi intended to exploit this victory by capturing the strategic city of Dimapur in the Brahmaputra River Valley. If this could be achieved, his army would be through the mountainous border region, and the whole of northeast India would be open to attack. Units of the Indian National Army were to take part in the offensive and raise rebellion in India. The capture of Dimapur railhead would also sever the land communications to the air bases used to supply the Chinese via the Hump, and cut off supplies to General Stilwell's forces fighting on the northern front. Preliminary battles. The Japanese began crossing the Chinwin River on 8 March. Scoons only gave his forward divisions orders to withdraw to Imphal on 13th March. The 20th Indian Division withdrew from Tamu without difficulty, but the 17th Indian Division was cut off at Tidum, around here, by the Japanese 33rd Division. From 18th to 25th March, the 17th Division was able to fight its way back through 4 Japanese roadblocks, thanks to air resupply by the RAF and U.S. Troop Carrier Command crews in their Douglas C-47 Skytrains, and assistance from Scoons Reserve. The 23rd Indian Division, the 2 divisions, reached the Imphal Plain on 4th April, here. Meanwhile, Imphal had been left vulnerable to the Japanese 15th Division. The only force left covering the northern approaches to this base, the 50th Indian Parachute Brigade, was roughly handled at the Battle of Sangshak and forced to withdraw by a regiment from the Japanese 31st Regiment, their 31st Division, on its way to Kohima. However, the diversionary attack launched by the Japanese 55th Division in Arakan, down here, had already been defeated, and in late March, Slim was able to move the battle-hardened 5th Indian Division with all its artillery, jeeps, mules, and other material by air from Arakan to the central front. The move was completed in only 11 days. The division's HQ and 2 brigades went to Imphal. The other brigade, the 161st Indian Infantry Brigade, went to Dimapur, from where it sent a detachment to Kohima. In this image, British soldiers searched through long grass for Japanese snipers while covered by a Bren gun team. Kohima. While the Allied forces in Imphal were cut off and besieged, the Japanese 31st Division, consisting of 20,000 men under Lieutenant General Kotoku Sato, advanced up the Imphal-Dimapur road. Instead of isolating the small garrison at Kohima and pressing on with his main force to Dimapur, Sato chose to concentrate on capturing the hill station. The Japanese records indicate that Sato and Mutaguchi's other divisional commanders had severe misgivings about 15th Army's plan. In particular, they thought the logistic gambles were reckless and were unwilling to drive on objectives they thought unattainable. The Battle of Kohima started on 6th April when the Japanese isolated the garrison and tried to dislodge the defenders from their hilltop redoubts. Fighting was very heavy around the bungalow and tennis court of the Deputy Commissioner of the Naga Hills. This phase of the battle is often referred to as the Battle of the Tennis Court and was the high water mark of the Japanese attack. On 18th April, the 161st Indian Brigade relieved the defenders, but the battle was not over as the Japanese dug in and defended the positions they had captured. A new Allied formation HQ, the 33rd Corps, under Lieutenant General Montague Stopford, took over operations at this front. The British 2nd Division began a counteroffensive, and by 15th May, they had prized the Japanese off Kohima Ridge itself, although the Japanese still held dominating positions north and south of the ridge. Once again, the key factor in this counterattack to chase the Japanese off the hill was a tank. It was an M3 Lee tank carried over the jungle, through the jungle, by manpower. The Japanese had nothing to stop the tank. More Allied troops were arriving at Kohima. The 7th Indian Division followed the 5th Indian Division from the Arakan. An Indian Motor Infantry Brigade reinforced 2nd Division, and a brigade diverted from the Chindit operation cut Japanese 31st Division supply lines. 33rd Corps renewed its offensive in the middle of May. Imphal. Here is an image from the Battle of Imphal. While Kohima only had one Lee Grant tank, here are Gurkhas advancing with a Grant tank, with Grant tanks, so the more than one here, to clear the Japanese from the Imphal-Kohima road in northeastern British India. The Battle of Imphal went badly for the Japanese during April, as their attacks from several directions on the Imphal plain failed to break the Allied defensive ring. The fighting took place in three main sectors. The Japanese 15th Division's attacks from the north were broken when infantry from the 5th Indian Division and M3 Lee tanks recaptured a vital hill at Nangshigum, which overlooked the main airstrip at Imphal on 13th April. Fighting between Yamamoto Force and the reduced 20th Indian Division swayed back and forth through the hills on either side of the main Imphal-Tamu road throughout the month. The Japanese 33rd Division was slow to throw in its main attack from the south, but there was severe fighting around the village of Bishanpur for several weeks. At the start of May, Slim and Schoons began a counteroffensive against the Japanese 15th Division north of Imphal. Progress was slow. The monsoon had broken, making movement very difficult. Also, 4th Corps was suffering from shortages. Although rations and reinforcements were delivered to Imphal by air, artillery ammunition was running short. However, the Japanese were at the end of their endurance. Neither their 31st Division nor their 15th Division had received adequate supplies since the offensive began, and during the rains, disease rapidly spread among the starving Japanese troops. Lieutenant General Sato had notified Mutaguchi that his division would withdraw from Kohima at the end of May if it were not supplied. In spite of orders to hold on, Sato did indeed begin to retreat, although an independent detachment from his division continued to fight, delaying actions along the Imphal road. Meanwhile, the units of 15th Division were wandering away from their positions to forage for supplies. Its commander, Lieutenant General Masafumi Yamauchi, who was mortally ill, was dismissed, but this could not affect matters. The leading British and Indian troops of 4th Corps and 33rd Corps met at milestone 109 on the Dimapur-Imphal road on 22nd June, and the siege of Imphal was raised. Here are men of the 1st Battalion, Devonshire Regiment, part of the 80th Indian Infantry Brigade of the 20th Indian Infantry Division, with Japanese flags captured at Nippon Ridge during the Battle of Imphal, Kohima. Mutaguchi and Kawabe nevertheless continued to order renewed attacks. 33rd Division, under a new forceful commander, Lieutenant General Nobuo Tanaka, and Yamamoto Force, made repeated efforts south of Imphal, but by the end of June they had suffered so many casualties, both from battle and disease, that they were unable to make any progress. The Allies had in the meantime cleared large numbers of starving and disordered Japanese troops in and around Ukhrul, near Sangshak, north of Imphal. The Japanese Imphal operation was finally broken off in early July, and they retreated painfully to the Chindwin River. Aftermath. The attempted invasion of India was the largest defeat to that date in Japanese history. They had suffered 55,000 casualties, including 13,500 dead. Most of these losses were the result of disease, malnutrition, and exhaustion. The Allies suffered 17,500 casualties. This is the Imphal War Cemetery. Mutaguchi was relieved of his command and left Burma for Singapore in disgrace. Sato refused to commit seppuku, harakiri, when handed a sword by Colonel Shumei Kinoshita, insisting that the defeat had not been his doing. He was examined by doctors who stated that his mental health was such that he could not be court-martialed, probably under pressure from Kawabe and Terauchi, who did not wish a public scandal. From August to November, 14th Army pursued the Japanese to the Chindwin River despite heavy monsoon rains, while the newly arrived 11th East Africa Division advanced down the Kabao Valley from Tamu and improved the road behind them. The 5th Indian Division advanced along the mountainous Tiddim Road. As 14th Army planned to use only the Kabao Valley route for supply during the next season's campaign, the Tiddim Road, which included evocatively named stretches such as the Chocolate Staircase, was allowed to fall into ruin behind the 5th Division, which was supplied entirely by parachute drops. An improvised light formation, the Lu Shai Brigade, was used to interrupt the lines of communication of the Japanese defending the road. By the end of November, Kalewa, an important river port on the Chindwin, had been recaptured, and several bridgeheads had been established on the east bank of the Chindwin. Slim and his corps commanders schoons, Christensen and Stopford, were knighted in front of Scottish, Gurkha, and Punjab regiments by the Viceroy Lord Wavell in a ceremony at Imphal in December. Here is a Dodge weapon carrier transport on the Tidham Road during the monsoon. So you can see how brown and thick and soft it was, giving it the name the Chocolate Staircase.